Sorry.
Okay.
So I had a question in regard to your debate with Pine Sap recently.
Uh-huh.
So I noticed that one of your objections was about the epistemological
Right.
issues with his worldview in regard to foundationalism.
Right.
Can you elaborate a bit on that and how we don't really fall into that same error? Because I kind of had trouble following after that.
Right, because if you noticed, we've constantly argued for tag, right? Transcendental argument.
Yeah.
That's connected to a holistic view of epistemology, which denies that there's anything that's self-evident. And the reason I think that is because anytime you try to drill down into what you think is self-evident or what you think is axiomatic, it really falls apart very quickly, because anything that you posit, for example, you're immediately in the dilemma of the criterion problem of Chisholm, where on the one hand, if you want to say that you know something, that requires a criteria of knowledge. But to have a criteria of knowledge also requires that you know something. So you see you're caught in an immediate sort of recursive circle there. It also deals with problems of delineation. Like, if I think there are certain things that are self-evident and certain things that aren't, that actually presupposes a more prior category of sussing those two categories out. Right? So I'm actually, again, contradicting myself by saying that, well, there's all these self-evident things, and that relies on my criteria of self-evident and non-self-evident things. So at every point, any position that posits something being self-evident ends up relying on brute factuality and the assumption that our beliefs and our knowledge are not theory-laden, that they're non-theory-laden and therefore self-evident brute facts. But the problem is that everything since the Enlightenment, philosophy-wise, has really demonstrated over and over and over that there's not brute facts. There's really no way to to prove or demonstrate a brute fact. And every time we ask for the epistemic justification for brute factuality or self-evidence, they immediately collapse and crumble. So when we have a different position, that's why it's called worldview apologetics. It's holistic. It's a holistic epistemology that doesn't include any epistemic bootstrapping move that's made. All of their positions are based on epistemic bootstrapping. That's why even Sam Harris, right, says, well, if I could just find one sort of Archimedean point by which I can sort of leap off, then I can build an entire system. And that's the same enterprise, whether you're a Thomist or whether you're Yaron Brook atheist, or whether you're Stefan Molyneux, or whether you're any of these people. Have you not noticed, even the Muslims, even Azra Rashid, right? His whole position, just like Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, it all starts with self-evident, doxastic basicality of these starting points, and nobody can tell me why I'm supposed to start there or why those things are the case. It's just arbitrary.
Okay. I got that. I think my main question, and forgive me if I'm being kind of holding things up, but what do you think would be the papist sort of starting point for that? Because I've been kind of talking with I've a friend who unfortunately went to Roman Catholicism instead of Orthodoxy, and he kind of always makes these same arguments, but we've never really addressed the epistemological questioning of
exactly.
it. Exactly.
So that's why I'm going to that, because just like I was saying with Tim, like when we were chatting in DMs, he's like, well, metaphysics doesn't allow you to have the essence-energy distinction. I'm like, well, says who? He's like, well, because that's like the metaphysics, man. That's like what it is, and Aquinas and Aristotle. And I'm like, are they God? I'm sorry, like, why am I supposed to believe that like their metaphysics is necessarily true? So you're asking a more fundamental question of like, what are the starting points? Well, for example, the peripatetic axiom is something that Aquinas accepts. There's nothing in the intellect that is not first in sense data. So that's one of those things. Any of the other basic principles of Aristotelian natural science would be things that most Thomists accept. They would just say that, well, how do we know that first principles are true? Well, you just have to assume them to do anything. Okay, but having to assume them or saying that I can't see how it's otherwise doesn't actually grant me justification. And it's very easy to demonstrate that that's not enough. Father Deacon has a whole paper on this. It's really good, just showing that, well, the fact that I can't conceive of it otherwise, that doesn't actually mean that it's the case in the world.
Yeah, that would be like an appeal to ignorance, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And that's have you read the Mannion paper? Because he actually addresses all these these approaches.
No, I haven't. But while I'm at it, is it okay, Father, if you link that paper so that I can read it?
The Mannion paper or his paper about justification?
Both would actually be good.
He's here if he can find it.
You put it in the YouTube chat.
Yeah, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, if he's on YouTube. The Mannion paper is called The Contingency of Knowledge and Revelatory Theism. That's the Mannion paper. And he actually addresses this idea of the Thomistic notion of self-evidence on the section under the deductive problem. And he says, well, for example, we might think that the external world is coherent and rational and logical and ordered, but how do we know that that's not just our mental schema that we have in our minds that we assume maps onto the world, and perhaps we're just schizophrenic or whatever? Again, like low IQ people think that I'm saying that we're all schizophrenic or I'm being a skeptic. These are just arguments that are defeaters for self-evidence. That's all it is. Okay, I'm not actually arguing that we're schizophrenic and that we don't have a coherent worldview. The point is that there's no account for these self-evident principles just by saying, well, they seem to be necessary and I can't conceive of it otherwise, and so therefore I assume that it maps onto the world. Well, remember, in epistemic self-evidence or self or basicality or whatever, we're not supposed to be assuming things.
Right. It's that's the point of philosophy. I remember you.
Well, but I mean, even in their own view, like even as a foundationalist, if your self-evident maxim assumes other things, then it's not self-evident.
Right. No, I appreciate those. I'm going to go now, but thank you very much for answering the questions, and thank you for the paper, Father.
Yeah, they're in the chat there.
Yeah, and the irony is that anybody